We're still on the asylum bandwagon, and Yvette Cooper's plan to deport more than 14,000 illegal migrants and foreign criminals by the end of the year raises significant ethical concerns, particularly when evaluated through the lens of human rights and international law. Critics argue that the plan risks violating the 1951 Refugee Convention, which the UK is bound to uphold. I'm entirely in agreement with that. The Convention prohibits the expulsion or the return of refugees or to territories where their lives or their freedom would be threatened. And deportation under Cooper's plan may not always allow for adequate consideration of individual asylum claims, which could lead to refoulement, that is, sending people back into danger, a clear breach of international law. So there are three areas which need to be considered. First of all, this idea about whether or not Cooper's plan is ethical. Secondly, whether it's politically possible. And thirdly, whether or not it's better than what has happened in the past. So she's being compared to Theresa May, or she wants to compare herself to Theresa May. I think probably the better option is to compare her to Blunkett. And I think it's important to look at the 1951 Refugee Convention that determines the way in which refugees are managed. And people in the comments section, there's one person in particular who keeps repeating Article 31, which talks about people claiming asylum in the first safe country. Well, the majority of people, the 75% of the people who are refugees claim asylum in the first safe country. 69% are claiming it in a neighbouring country. And it's a very small group of people who manage to get to Europe. And of those who get to Europe, the majority claim asylum in Germany, 351,000 in 2023, 166,000, nearly 167,000 in Spain, 162,000 in France. 84,424 claimed asylum in 2023 in Britain. And so we are in the modest area of this problem. But when we look at Article 31, it has to be interpreted through legal precedents, particularly in Britain. And Britain has been part of that debate. And there are two particular rulings which are of significance. One was a ruling about allowing 70 days for transit from the host country, from the country of origin to the country where the individual claimed asylum under a British ruling. And the other was in 1999 by Lord Justice Simon Brown, I think, who talked about an element of choice. And his ruling was based on this 70 days principle. And the moment we left the Dublin regulation and the Eurodac database, which that provided, so we could fingerprint people when they arrived in Britain and see whether or not their fingerprints matched fingerprints taken, let's say, in Athens or in another European country, and then send them back to their port of first entry. We left that. We left the Dublin regulation, the European Common Asylum System, the Eurodac database. And this was down to Lord Frost's stupidity. And he didn't place anything, he didn't arrange anything in its place. Meaning that anybody who comes to this country cannot be automatically returned, let's say, to France. And no matter how much the right-wing rhetoricians bang on about France being a safe country and therefore why would anybody come from a safe country to Britain defying Article 31, anybody who bangs on about that simply hasn't got the legal knowledge and is behaving in a sort of cack-handed, knee-jerk way and is ignoring precedents and is ignoring the stupidity of Lord Frost. And Yvette Cooper, I hope, is wise enough to realise that. You can't just return people to the last safe country. So that means it's about returning people to their country of origin, and that is where the issue of refoulement comes in. And even returning people to a third country like Albania or Rwanda risks the problem of refoulement, because if that third country then sends them on, they could end up back in their own country, back in their home country, where they could be persecuted. They may not merit asylum, but it doesn't mean they're safe to return. And that is it's that hole which is the problem area, particularly once leaving the Dublin regulation. So what Yvette Cooper is doing is returning to the Blunkett position of detention, the Campsfield House and all that sort of stuff, which caused a lot of problems for the last Labour government. And it's an invitation to look at the damaging effects of immigration detention on mental health, the questionable fairness of the process, as many detainees are released without being deported. The use of detention as a tool to control immigration has been criticised for treating individuals like criminals, incarcerating them in what is effectively a concentration camp, undermining the dignity and the humanity of migrants. Now, we've already seen an element of that down on the south coast, and indeed overcrowding, disease that Suella Braverman was not minded to address, or at least not with any speed, and she should be criticised severely for that. Equally, there was the Robert Jenrick issue about the removing of the welcoming cartoons. As James Wilson of Detention Action points out, immigration detention is inherently damaging and inefficient, with a significant percentage of detainees ultimately not being deported but rather being released. So can it work? Politically, Yvette Cooper's plan aims to address the growing public concern over immigration, a topic that's been a significant political issue in the UK for years. It's been revved up, it's been ramped up by the Conservative Party and by Reform, well over its real impact. But the feasibility of the plan that Yvette Cooper is putting forward is debatable. Historical comparisons are necessary with David Blunkett and Theresa May, former Home Secretaries, and it suggests that aggressive immigration control measures often face substantial practical challenges that got nothing to do with protests or with activists objecting politically, ethically, morally to these issues. David Blunkett, who served as Home Secretary in the early 2000s, implemented tough immigration policies, including the expansion of detention centres and stricter asylum processes. However, these measures led to widespread criticism and legal challenges, particularly concerning the treatment of asylum seekers. And remember, he was able to draw on the Dublin Protocol and the Eurodac database and the European Common Asylum System. Today, we're not able to draw on that at all. Theresa May's tenure was marked by the development of what she called the hostile environment, which was interpreted by Home Office civil servants as simply a go slow. The hostile environment aimed to make staying in the UK as difficult as possible for those without legal status. And this policy led to, directly, the Windrush scandal, which has still not been properly resolved, where legal residents were wrongly detained and deported, highlighting the risks of harsh immigration enforcement measures. Cooper's plan may face similar difficulties. The logistical challenge of deporting 14,000 people within a short time frame is immense, particularly when considering a complex legal process that would be involved. Additionally, the plan's reliance on increased enforcement and detention risks further straining the already overburdened immigration system, leading to potential human rights violations and significant financial cost. Moreover, Critics argue that Cooper's plan may not address the root causes of irregular migration, such as global conflict and economic disparity. Instead, it could push migrants into more dangerous situations, as suggested by Steve Smith of Care for Calais, who pointed out that such deterrent measures often force people to take greater risks rather than reduce migration. Deterrence doesn't work. When compared to the Rwanda scheme under the previous Conservative government, this absurd scheme put forward by Suella Braverman, who was simply enacting the paperwork prepared by her predecessor Priti Patel, the paperwork which was described by James Cleverly, who came after her, as batshit crazy. It was intended as a deterrent, but it was widely regarded as a failure. Not least because Rwanda isn't a safe country. Rwanda has been housing refugees, and there has been clearly reported incidents of the killing of refugees savagely, simply because they questioned where their next meal was coming from. The savage execution of 13 refugees. Mainstream news talks about 10 refugees. It was 12 refugees. It was actually 13. And an adequate report has never been produced. So when the Supreme Court said that Rwanda was not a safe country, they were right. And simply to define it safe, as in the third of the Suella Braverman laws, early this year, is not an adequate response. You can't define red as green. The other two Suella Braverman laws, the illegal immigration law and the nationality and borders law, which place a legal responsibility on the Home Secretary to deport so-called illegal migrants. They're only illegal migrants under British regulation because they came here by illegal routes. That, coming to a country by an illegal route, is not considered inappropriate under the 1951 Refugee Convention, under Article 31. And therefore, those laws need to be repealed if Yvette Cooper is going to have any credibility at all. If she keeps those laws, her position morally is Lilliputian. So the Rwanda plan was criticised for its ethical implications, its lack of effectiveness, with only a handful of volunteers, as well as the Home Secretary, actually visiting Rwanda, and at least one of those has disappeared. Cooper's plan might similarly fall short if it focuses more on deportation numbers than on creating a fair and sustainable immigration system post-Brexit. Cooper's plan wants to address public concerns about immigration and deal with the noise coming from Reform UK. But Cooper would be foolish indeed if she is dictated to, as the previous Conservative government was dictated to, by a man in the pub swilling a pint of beer. That person may be now elected to Parliament, but you wouldn't know it because he spends most of his time outside Parliament in the United States, talking in Arizona and getting paid for that, or talking on GB News and getting paid for that. Nigel Farage should not be dictating government policy. And the historical precedent of similar policies that, without careful implementation, sort of egged on by Nigel Farage, without careful respect for human rights, have led to legal, political and humanitarian problems which have trapped the Home Office in chaos. So whether Yvette Cooper's plan can succeed where previous efforts have failed, particularly when she is responding to Nigel Farage and his claque, remains highly uncertain and looks improbable.